They say evil doesn't announce itself, it whispers. On a frost-covered morning in February 1987, a maintenance worker named Gerald Hutchins pushed open the door to room 14 at the Riverside Motor Lodge in rural Pennsylvania. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was an immaculate bed made with hospital corners, towels folded into perfect triangles, not a single item out of place. Except for one thing. 23 Polaroid photographs arranged in a perfect circle on the carpet, each one showing a different person's final moments. The police would later discover that every single person in those photographs had been reported missing over the past 4 years. And they were all still alive when the pictures were taken. What would you do if you opened that door? The case of Marcus Holloway, known in the media as the Architect, remains one of the most psychologically disturbing investigations in American criminal history. Not because of the brutality of his crimes, though they were horrific. Not because of the body count, though it was substantial. But because of the meticulous, almost loving care he took in documenting the psychological destruction of his victims before their deaths. Marcus Holloway was 34 years old when he was arrested. He worked as a city planner for a mid-sized municipality, lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house, and had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, always willing to help carry groceries or shovel snow from an elderly person's driveway. His coworkers said he was competent, but unremarkable, the kind of person you'd forget was in the room. That was exactly how he wanted it. The investigation began not with room 14, but 3 years earlier, in 1984, with the disappearance of a 26-year-old graduate student named Rebecca Marsh. She vanished on a Tuesday evening after leaving the university library. Her car was found in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, her backpack on the passenger seat with her wallet, ID, and cash untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads. Rebecca's case went cold within months. Then came David Chun, a 31-year-old accountant who disappeared after leaving his office on a Friday afternoon. His car was found at a rest stop along Interstate 76, locked with his briefcase still inside. Again, no signs of struggle. No witnesses, no leads. The pattern continued. Every 6 to 8 weeks, someone would vanish. Always adults between 25 and 40. Always taken from public places with their vehicles left behind, undisturbed. The victims seemed to have nothing in common: different genders, different professions, different backgrounds. The only thread connecting them was geography. They all disappeared within a 50-mile radius of the same rural Pennsylvania county. Would you have noticed the pattern? Detective Sarah Brennan did. She was a 15-year veteran of the state police, assigned to the missing persons unit. While her colleagues saw isolated cases, she saw something else. The precision. The timing. The complete absence of physical evidence. This wasn't random. This was someone who planned meticulously, who understood how investigations worked, who knew exactly how to avoid leaving traces. But knowing someone was responsible and finding them were two entirely different things. The break came from an unexpected source. In January 1987, a woman named Linda Hartwell walked into a police station in Ohio, 200 miles from where the disappearances occurred. She was disheveled, malnourished, and deeply traumatized. She told a story that seemed impossible. She said she'd been held captive for 9 months. Linda had disappeared from a grocery store parking lot in April 1986. She remembered a man approaching her, asking for directions. She remembered him seeming harmless, professional, wearing a suit. She remembered him showing her a map. Then nothing until she woke up in darkness. What she described next would become the foundation for understanding Marcus Holloway's methodology. Linda said she'd been kept in what felt like a small room, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet. She was never physically restrained. The door wasn't even locked. But she couldn't leave because she couldn't see. The room was kept in absolute darkness, not dim, not shadowy, but completely, utterly black. She couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. Food appeared at irregular intervals. Sometimes she'd wait what felt like hours, sometimes days. She had no way to track time. The food was always the same: plain oatmeal, room temperature, left in a bowl she could find by touch. Water came from a bottle placed beside it. There was a bucket in one corner for waste. That was all. She never heard her captor's voice, never saw his face, never knew if he was watching her in the darkness. Can you imagine 9 months in absolute darkness? The psychological torture was methodical. Linda described how she'd initially screamed, begged, pounded on the walls. Nothing. No response. Eventually, she stopped. She said the silence became worse than any physical pain could have been. She began talking to herself just to hear a human voice. She created elaborate fantasies about her life before, replaying memories in obsessive detail just to maintain some sense of identity. She said the worst part was the uncertainty. Not knowing if she'd been there for days or months. Not knowing if anyone was looking for her. Not knowing if she'd ever leave. The darkness stripped away everything: her sense of time, her sense of space, eventually even her sense of self. Then one day the door opened. Light flooded in, blinding after so long in darkness. She heard footsteps. A man's voice, calm and measured, said, "You can go now." She stumbled out, found herself in what looked like a basement. Stairs led up to a door that opened to the outside. She ran. She kept running until she found a road, then a gas station, then help. Linda's testimony led investigators back to Pennsylvania. They began searching for properties that matched her description: isolated, with basements, owned or rented by single men with no criminal records. The list was long. Too long. But Detective Brennan noticed something in Linda's account. She'd mentioned that during her captivity she sometimes heard a distant, rhythmic sound like machinery or construction. It was faint but regular. Brennan cross-referenced the list of properties with locations near active construction sites or industrial facilities. That narrowed it down to 43 addresses. They started surveillance, and that's when they noticed Marcus Holloway. He lived in a house that backed up to an abandoned quarry where a gravel company still operated machinery twice a week. He fit the profile: single, professional, unremarkable. But what caught their attention was his routine. Every 6 to 8 weeks, he'd take a week of vacation from work. And during those weeks, he'd barely leave his house. They obtained a warrant. On February 12, 1987, they entered Marcus Holloway's home. The house itself was ordinary. Clean, organized, furnished with inexpensive but functional furniture. Nothing unusual in the living room, kitchen, or bedroom. But in the basement, they found something that would change everything they thought they knew about serial killers. The basement had been divided into 4 separate rooms, each one 8 feet by 8 feet, each one soundproofed and light-proofed. 3 were empty. 1 was occupied. Inside, they found a man named Thomas Whitmore who'd been missing for 7 months. He was alive, physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered. He couldn't speak coherently. He couldn't make eye contact. When they brought him into the light, he curled into a fetal position and wept. What do you think breaks first, the body or the mind? But the rooms themselves weren't the most disturbing discovery. That came when they found Marcus Holloway's journals. He'd kept meticulous records of every person he'd taken. Not just names and dates, but detailed psychological profiles. He'd researched his victims extensively before taking them: their jobs, their families, their habits, their fears. He'd chosen them specifically for their psychological resilience. He wanted people who were strong, stable, successful. People who had everything to live for. Because he wanted to watch them break. The journals described his methodology with clinical precision. He explained that physical torture was crude, temporary. But psychological torture: isolation, sensory deprivation, the complete removal of control and certainty, that destroyed something fundamental, that changed who a person was at their core. He wrote about the stages his victims went through. First came panic and resistance, then bargaining and pleading, then depression and withdrawal. Finally, what he called dissolution, the point where their sense of self began to fragment, where they could no longer maintain a coherent identity without external stimuli. That's when he'd release them. He'd keep them just long enough to break them, then let them go. He'd watch from a distance as they tried to reintegrate into their lives. He documented their struggles, the failed relationships, the lost jobs, psychiatric hospitalizations. He'd taken satisfaction in knowing he'd permanently altered who they were. Would you have believed this was possible? The journals revealed that Linda Hartwell wasn't his first release. She was his 7th. 6 others had been let go before her, all in different states, all too traumatized to provide useful information to police. Many had been institutionalized. 2 had taken their own lives. But not all his victims were released. The Polaroids found in room 14 at the Riverside Motor Lodge told a different story. Marcus had rented that room under a false name 6 months earlier. He'd paid cash for a year in advance. The motel owner, desperate for business, hadn't asked questions. Marcus had used it as a storage facility for his collection. The 23 photographs showed his victims at their breaking points, the moment when something fundamental inside them shattered. He documented it with the same clinical precision he brought to everything else. The images weren't violent in a conventional sense. There was no blood, no weapons, no physical harm visible. But the expressions on the faces, the absolute emptiness, the complete psychological collapse, were more disturbing than any crime scene photo the investigators had ever seen. Forensic analysis of the photographs, combined with the journals, allowed investigators to identify all 23 victims. 12 had been released and were still alive, though most were in psychiatric care. 11 had never been found. The search for bodies began. Marcus Holloway's property backed up to the abandoned quarry, which had been inactive for decades before the gravel company began limited operations. The quarry was deep, filled with water, surrounded by dense woods. It took 3 weeks of searching, but eventually they found them. The bodies had been weighted and submerged in the deepest part of the quarry. They'd been there for years, preserved by the cold water. Forensic examination revealed that none had died from violence. They'd died from dehydration, starvation, or in several cases what appeared to be voluntary cessation of eating and drinking. They'd given up. Could you have survived what they endured? Marcus Holloway's trial began in September 1987. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: the journals, the photographs, the testimony of survivors, the bodies. But what made the trial particularly disturbing was Marcus himself. He showed no remorse, no emotion. He answered questions with the same calm, measured tone he'd used in his journals. When asked why he'd done it, he said he'd been conducting an experiment. He wanted to understand the limits of human psychological resilience. He wanted to know what it took to fundamentally change a person's identity. When asked if he felt any guilt, he seemed genuinely confused by the question. He said he'd been careful to minimize physical harm. He provided food and water. He'd released many of them alive. He seemed to believe he'd been humane. The psychiatric evaluation revealed something chilling. Marcus Holloway wasn't legally insane. He understood right from wrong. He knew his actions were illegal. He simply didn't care. He had what the psychiatrists called profound empathy deficit, a complete inability to recognize or value the suffering of others. To him, his victims weren't people. They were subjects. Variables in an experiment. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Marcus Holloway was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He's currently incarcerated in a maximum security facility where he spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. The irony isn't lost on anyone. What would you have lost? Thomas Whitmore, the man found in Marcus's basement, never fully recovered. He spent 2 years in psychiatric care before taking his own life in 1989. His suicide note said simply, "I'm still in the dark." The other survivors have had varying outcomes. Some have managed to rebuild their lives, though all carry deep psychological scars. Others remain institutionalized. All of them describe the same fundamental change: a loss of trust, a persistent sense of unreality, a feeling that the world they return to isn't quite the same as the one they left. Detective Sarah Brennan, who led the investigation, retired from police work 3 years after Marcus's conviction. In interviews, she said that the case changed how she understood evil. She'd dealt with violent criminals before, people who killed in rage, in greed, in passion, but Marcus was different. He was methodical, patient, and completely devoid of human connection. She said the scariest thing about him was how ordinary he seemed, how easily he'd hidden in plain sight. The case raised disturbing questions about how many others might be doing the same thing. How many people disappear each year without explanation? How many of those disappearances might be the work of someone like Marcus? Someone who doesn't kill quickly, who doesn't leave obvious evidence, who understands exactly how to avoid detection. How many Marcus Holloways are still out there? In the years since his conviction, Marcus has given several interviews from prison. He remains calm, articulate, and utterly unrepentant. He's described his crimes as research and expressed frustration that his work was interrupted before he could complete his study. He's said he wishes he'd had more time to document the long-term effects of his methodology. When asked if he'd do it again, he said, "Of course. The data was invaluable. The psychological community has studied Marcus extensively, trying to understand what creates someone capable of such calculated cruelty. The consensus is that he represents a rare but terrifying type of personality, someone with high intelligence, strong organizational skills, and complete absence of empathy. Someone who views other humans as objects to be studied rather than beings to be valued. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is how it revealed the vulnerability of the human psyche. Marcus didn't need weapons or violence. He didn't need elaborate torture devices. All he needed was darkness, silence, and time. He proved that the mind, given the right conditions, will destroy itself. The survivors of his crimes are living proof of that. They're people who were strong, capable, successful until they weren't, until something fundamental inside them broke. And once broken, some things can never be fully repaired. The case files remain open for the families of victims who were never found. Despite Marcus's journals and the bodies recovered from the quarry, investigators believe there may be others. Marcus has hinted at additional victims but refuses to provide details. He seems to take satisfaction in knowing that some families will never have closure. Would you want to know? Or would ignorance be mercy? Room 14 at the Riverside Motor Lodge was sealed after the investigation concluded. The motel itself closed 2 years later. No one wanted to stay there after the story broke. The building still stands, abandoned, slowly decaying. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to break in, to see the room where the photographs were found. Most can't bring themselves to do it. The house where Marcus kept his victims was demolished in 1988. The property remains vacant. No one wants to build there. The quarry has been permanently closed and fenced off. It's become an unofficial memorial to the victims. People sometimes leave flowers at the fence, though there's no marker, no plaque, nothing to indicate what happened there. The darkness that Marcus Holloway created, both literal and metaphorical, continues to cast shadows. The survivors live with it. The families of victims live with it. The investigators who worked the case live with it. And somewhere, in a maximum security cell, Marcus Holloway lives with it too, though he'd never admit it affects him. Because the truth is, you can't spend that much time in darkness, even if you're the one who created it, without it changing you. Without it becoming part of you. Without it seeping into your soul and making a home there. Marcus Holloway proved that the human mind is both incredibly resilient and terrifyingly fragile. That we can endure unimaginable suffering, but that endurance comes at a cost. That survival doesn't always mean victory. That sometimes the worst thing that can happen isn't death, it's living with what was done to you. The case remains a subject of study in criminal psychology programs. It's used to train FBI profilers. It's referenced in discussions about the nature of evil and the limits of human cruelty. But for those who lived through it, the survivors, the families, the investigators, it's not an academic exercise. It's a wound that never fully heals. If you'd been in that darkness, who would you have become? The final entry in Marcus Holloway's journal, written the day before his arrest, reads, "The experiment continues. Even now, even after release, they carry the darkness with them. I've proven that you don't need to kill someone to destroy them. You just need to show them what they're capable of becoming when everything else is stripped away. You need to show them the truth about themselves. But perhaps the real truth is simpler and more terrifying, that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it wears a suit and asks for directions. Sometimes it lives next door and shovels your driveway. Sometimes it's patient enough to wait in the darkness, knowing that eventually, someone will open the door." If this case kept you thinking, subscribe. Another mystery unfolds next week.